to. Okay, we are live.
All right. Welcome. It's 9 o'clock on Thursday, May 30th, 2024, and this is the Beach Preservation Ad Hoc Committee. I'd like to call the meeting to order and acknowledge that the press and public have been duly notified of this meeting in accordance with the Freedom of Information Act. We have Dan, Andrew, myself, Katie, Steve, Douglas. We have Tim on the line, Tim and Moody on the line, and Desiree. So I think today the agenda item is to start the discussion of developing long and midterm preservation strategies. Steve has prepared a draft report that I think you're going to walk through today for us and give us an orientation. It looks like a really good piece of work, and it seems like it's moved us forward with some really good information, quantification, and interested to hear what you have to say. So I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks. And this draft report, calling it a draft because I wanted it to be something where this is kind of the first step, and after further discussions with this committee, if there's other pieces of information that we feel like need to be included in it, we're happy to make those adjustments and kind of have this as a working document until we can finalize it with to everybody's satisfaction. It really is kind of turning into more of a feasibility study like we would normally do, or a long-term plan where you go through the background, the erosion rates, and lay out different scenarios and alternatives. I initially did not break out like all the different alternatives because we talked a lot about some of them here, and I felt like we were wanting to get to big picture. What's the number that we're looking at for large-scale nourishment? Thinking about it the past couple of days, I know probably one thing I need to include is something on the interim projects, like these shoal management projects. That wasn't included in the the cost assessment, so that's something we can discuss. Is that appropriate for this document, or are we really looking towards the big scale things here? So I'm happy to get feedback and see answer any questions and kind of make this something that's very usable for the city, and then be able to turn over to the public as well. So trying to keep it on a not super technical, but have enough of the technical information to support what's in there. So I don't know how much of the background you want to go through. There's a little bit of just the fundamentals of what's going on the island and how sand moves, but I think we've covered that a good bit in this committee. Did want to just kind of go through the map because we do talk about different reaches and different stations and some of the data. You really want to know how the stations relate to where it really is in the real world. So just to kind of go through those stations, we set up a stationing system in our monitoring efforts in 2009, where we start at 0 is right at Breach Inlet, and then the stationing is the standard engineering stationing, where 10 plus 0, 0 is 1,000 feet up the baseline from 0. So that's 2,000 feet. So they are, the difference is a linear foot. The red labels here are the old OCRM beach monitoring stations that date back to the 80s. So some of our monitoring, we survey those stations as well. In some areas, we don't survey those stations because they've changed over time, or we have the standard stations that are pretty close to it, but you may see some references to those. And then we also have reaches, and the reaches are used to summarize regional changes where you're able to eliminate some of the variability that you see along a beach, either seasonally or just year to year. You may have one profile that gains sand, another profile that loses sand within a reach, but you kind of look at regional changes because that's a little easier to interpret sometimes. And we try to break those reaches up on the physical, or based off the physical characteristics. So we have one that's really kind of the breach inlet affected area. That's reach 1. Reach 2 is the front beach area south of the pier to, let's see, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th Avenue. Reach 3 and reach 4 are the center part of the island north of the pier up to 53rd Avenue. That's the area that's been very stable, very accretional, and where the houses are set back a pretty long ways. Reach 5 begins at 53rd Avenue, so 5 and 6 are the principal project area for the last two large-scale projects, with the boundary right at the property owner's beach house. And then Reach 7 is the Dewey's Inlet shoreline along the 17th hole and extending up to the end of the sandy part of the island. So you'll see those, stations identified and the reaches identified, like that. Again, going through some of the background, obviously, the island is highly dynamic around the inlets. That really controls the sand supply and the conditions that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. At the east end, you have these large shoals that attach anywhere from every 4 to 8 or 9 years. The average is about 7 years. Sometimes they're pretty small and may add 100,000 yards. Sometimes they're very large and add closer to 1 million yards of sand to the beach. The bigger they are, the slower they progress, but the bigger impacts they can have on the erosion and accretion patterns. And if I go back up to the top, that's kind of what's shown in this drumstick barrier island model. Is sand is pushed out of the inlets, and this happens on both inlets, Dewey's and Breach. So the currents push the sand out, the waves then turn around and try to push the sand back towards the beach, and it creates this quasi-equilibrium condition where you have a fairly standard shaped delta, but it's always moving. And we're always in some part of a cycle. The channel will breach through to the north. The sand that's in the shoal, kind of in this area, in this example, will eventually migrate to the south and onto the beach. At that same time as it's migrating, the channel's migrating back to the south again, and when it reaches a certain point, it'll breach back through. Again, that's about a 7 to 10 year cycle that these large-scale events happen. Down on the south end, we also get changes with the inlet, but you don't get these big shoal attachments that are occurring. Every once in a while, you can get a small shoal that does attach off the north side of a delta, but typically the big shoal attachments happen on the south side. On the north side, you get channels that move around, and if we kind of go back up to this example, there's usually a fairly large shoal that's on the north side, but it's more of a stable shoal. It can move, it can get little channels through it, but it doesn't have the big breaches and significant change like you do on the south side. And that's why Breach Inlet's been a lot more stable, the shoreline anyway. And I know we've talked a lot about the Breach Inlet side. It had been very stable or accretional in recent history, from 2009 to 2021. It really only lost about 6,000 yards of sand. Every year you'd gain some, you'd lose some. Some years, I think the most you would see in any given year was about 100,000 yards, but then the next year it would come right back. But the past 2 years, we've lost about 350,000 yards from that end. So we've just seen a significant acceleration in that. And most of that happened from 2023 up until December. Once we got into January, we're still in an eroded condition, but we're not seeing the losses like we were. We kind of hit that point and stabilized. And, we'll have good weeks and bad weeks, but we've seen areas gain sand. We've seen some areas continue to lose sand. Right now, it's really at the southern tip of the island that we're having the most struggle on the first couple of houses on the Breach Inlet shoreline, not even really on the front beach side. Stop me at any time if you have given a dissertation here. So now we'll get into some of the technical stuff. We talk about beach volume a lot, and the beach volume is how much sand is in the active part of the beach. So this is a series of profiles taken going all the way back to 1996. So this was using some of the OCRM data before we ever started monitoring the island for the city. And the quantity of sand is calculated from a starting point, which we call our offset, and then we end that at a point offshore where we really stop seeing measurable change. When you're doing bathymetric surveys, there's always a little bit of error with that because you're out on a boat, you're in the waves. So generally about 6 inches is the reported accuracy of a bathymetric survey like that. It's getting a lot better with technology than it was back in the 90s, but at some point, sand, you stop seeing these large-scale changes in beach volume, and we call that point the closure depth, and that's basically related to how much wave energy you have. So bigger wave energy moves sand at a deeper depth. So you look at closure depth on average at Isle of Palms, when you're in the middle part of the beach, is about minus 13 feet from sea level. If you look at, if a big hurricane comes through, it will move sand that's below that. If you're in calmer weather conditions, really you're not going to get much sand moving below that. So closure depth can be related to the time interval you're looking at. But if you look at a long data set like we have here, you can see all the change occurring up in the dunes. You're getting a huge dry beach accretion. This is at 47th Avenue. So we were at about 75 feet from the reference line here, and now we're at about 600 feet. So we've gained about 500 feet of beach in that area since 1996. So that's great. But offshore, everything kind of stops. So when we're calculating beach volume, we're basically starting at a reference point, which we could call, the crest of the dune or a structure line. And we'll usually use the structure line for the planning purposes we're talking about here. And then the point offshore, the closure depth. We're not measuring volumes out here because really all you're measuring is the error in the survey. So we try to cut that off. So the volume is the area under the curve in these profiles. So you measure, a profile that has a lot more sand in it's going to have a higher beach volume. And when we're doing that, we unitize it by length of beach, and so it's cubic yards of sand per foot of beach. So we'll say there may be 100 cubic yards in every linear foot. So as you're looking, if you're standing looking at the ocean, you imagine a 1 foot width of that beach. It's how much sand is in that 1 foot width from the dune all the way out to deeper water. And then you compare year to year, and you can measure how much volume has been gained or lost year to year between two stations. So we see cross-shore movement. Cross-shore movement is when sand moves from the dune out to sandbars or sandbars back up into the dry sand beach or up into the dune. That can happen on a very short-term basis. With a big storm event, you'll get sand that erodes from the dune and gets deposited in an offshore bar. Calmer weather will push that sand back up the beach, and you really don't lose any volume. You may lose 60 feet of dune, but all that sand is out in the water and will come back to the beach at some point. So cross-shore losses aren't generally as much of a concern other than, are we protected? Did you lose so much dune that you're not protected after that storm event? When sand goes along shore, up or down the beach, then it's leaving that area and going somewhere else. So the along-shore losses are due to waves approaching at an angle, so it's pushing sand one way or another up or down the beach. And that's where you get erosion or accretion over time. As new sand's added or more sand is leaving than is being added. So we look at sediment transport rates, and you can look at gross rates. Gross rates are a little harder to determine because you're looking at sand that's moving one day to the south, and then the next day it's moving to the north. Well, you're doubling your rate, whereas net losses, you may not lose anything, but sand's still moving constantly.
So in some simplistic means where this says the profile of Beechwood presently holds about 340 cubic yards of sand per linear foot. Let's say we picked a 400-foot healthy beach. We're 60 feet deficient in that area. Multiply that by the distance, and that's going to be what we have to, and then add the time we want to put on top of it, and that gives us our requirement.
And you are halfway to being a coastal engineer.
Well,
that's really
that's a scary thought.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
That's really it's you're quantifying how much sand do you need to get to a healthy condition, and then how much sand in addition to that you need to keep that condition over a certain amount of time. Assuming that the world is working in the future like it's worked in the past, and our erosion rates aren't changing.
And one question, when you say in the past, you mean in the last 6 years or you mean in the last 20 years?
Yeah, and that's a good question because, we like to look at as much data as we can. So we'll go back. There's some shoreline surveys that go back to the 1800s The accuracy of those are somewhat questionable. There's aerial photographs that go back to the 30s in some areas that we can get almost 100 years worth of, pretty accurate shoreline measurements. But we've also had things change, like, when Murrells Inlet jetties were built in, I think, 69 or the 70s. Anything that happened after the jetties were built in Georgetown is a different physical situation now, because those jetties fixed that inlet and it's changed the dynamics there. So the same thing happened at Charleston Harbor when they built those jetties. Now, we don't have a whole lot of data before then to know, but that changed the physical processes affecting this area. So you have to look at what's happened. You look at the history to say what should happen, but then you also have to kind of say, what's our best measure going forward? Is 40 years the best data to use, or are we more likely to face what we've faced the past 10 years in the future? And it's kind of a balance. We don't want to overcorrect. Like, again, at the south end, I don't feel like we're going to be losing 300,000 yards of sand every 2 years down there based off the history, but until it does correct, we see that, then you want to at least have that in the back of your mind as you're planning. So we don't want to assume that it's only going to be, it's going to be stable or accretional like it has been historically, because that's certainly changing, and we are seeing more erosion up and down the state the past 10 years than we have before.
So is it an outlier, or is it the new norm?
Right.
And that's,
Yeah, and we can't answer that question. If there was some obvious physical change that we could see, like, a structure was built or a new inlet opened up somewhere that, happens in some other areas, that can change your processes, but nothing has really happened here that it's an obvious physical change like that.
Is this where our policies and triggers and all that kind of come into play? We want to make sure, we're going to base the plan off of a set of assumptions, but if those assumptions change or trigger hits, we do something.
Yes, anything on the coast, you want to have a plan, but you want to have flexibility in that plan. Because you may, one huge storm can completely throw off your calculation. And you kind of just have to acknowledge that and deal with that as it comes. Because we can design a project for a modest scale hurricane, but a direct hit by a Category 4 or Category 5, you almost can't build a dune big enough for that. It's just, okay, that's catastrophic. How are we best to recover? And certainly it aids in resiliency, it aids in protection, but I don't want to promise, no property is going to be damaged at all. It's just not the real world.
Bottom line, no matter what we do, none of this is a permanent solution. It's evolving throughout our lifetime.
Correct.
I mean, that's one of the biggest things to get out for understanding. I think the whole point of these meetings, ourselves included, is to make sure everybody's aware that that's the case.
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about.
Correct. You're trying to set yourself up for long-term growth of the beach. The Grand Strand's a good example because they had seawalls in the 80s. They did an initial project that was fairly small, but they built on projects. And over time, they've added 2 rows of dunes, an access path, and they've actually increased their resiliency over time. It's a much easier case because they have a low erosion rate. It's a long, straight beach without any big inlets. So it's a little simpler there. But the same kind of thing can be accomplished here. And you're trying to avoid critically eroded conditions where properties are threatened. And if a storm should hit, you don't want it to be in that condition because then you do have the catastrophic damage.
Which is kind of where we are right now, I guess. So
In a
one thing I
couple
want to
of
talk
areas,
about,
yeah.
and I guess we can get to them, and there is what are the fixes, what are the patches along the way? So we've got a 8-year window between the nourishments. What are we going to do next time to kind of patch the properties? For example, the shoal management that we're looking at right now on the north end. I mean, I think those things are critical to kind of evaluate and determine how do we do those, and what do we set up in place so that when we have problems, we don't have to wait the full period before we come back.
Correct. We had this conversation the other day with another group on you want as many tools as you can have in your toolbox to be able to solve the situation based off the conditions at the time. Does the conditions right now warrant a $20 million large scale project when you only have a dozen properties currently kind of in a bad situation? Or maybe it does, maybe it doesn't.
And I get it, but then what do we do about those dozen properties?
Right, and that's where having a different tool where, okay, this is a more modest scale approach to buy us time and solve that one condition. And that may be shoal management, it may be sandbags in some areas if But you would have the ability to make that decision based off the conditions at the time. For example, if we would have had the shoal management project permit this past winter, you would have had the ability to move sand. However, there wasn't a shoal accessible at that point. So really, at that point, your only option to move sand would have been to take sand from the avenues area where we've proposed it in this permit, or truck sand in from an inland source. Trucking sand in from an inland source, 100,000 yards at that cost is a $4 million project, as opposed to a $400,000 project if you're moving it from the avenues. It's a huge difference. So you weigh, and that's not guaranteed. You move the sand there and hope that it sustains long enough for the kind of the cycle to manifest and evolve. But if it doesn't, you still may be in a situation where you may need sandbags or do another project to move sand around. So even if you have these tools, you'll have to look at the conditions at the time to see, does it actually make sense to do that particular effort at that time based off the configuration of the beach.
So you gotta figure out which tool to use at the given time.
But having the ability to do that, and having the permits in hand, I think is a big step.
Yeah, I think kind of, Monday morning quarterbacking our current scenario, and looking back, if the staff had guidance, permits, and funding to kind of give options to city council at certain triggers, if it's, and these triggers are talked to in this plan, if it's a short line of, it's a hot spot of erosion, here's kind of the menu of options. We have the permission in place. We have the funding in place. Council, what would you like to do in this situation? And you make that choice. And then if it's a bigger stretch, kind of a larger problem, we also would like to have the permits in place, the funding in place to be able to say at this point, it's more than a hot spot. We think it's approaching kind of
Project level.
full-scale project. Kind of have these, decision-making
On the
points.
shelf, like ready to go.
Waiting,
Like, you just
ready to
run
go,
in,
where you can
grab
go to
what you need,
council and
and
say.
That's what we do.
So that kind of at a high level, that I think is what we would like to have going forward, is just the permission, the funding, the options already laid out, the pros and cons of each option, which should make us coming to council, and it'll,
Well, that feathers right into the three objectives of the whole ad hoc
Yeah.
committee here, and I think with what Steve's got here, and I would encourage anybody that's listening or interested, the report's posted out there and read through it. It's a short read, but I think this is gonna help us get to those.
And I think some of the nuts and bolts, and we've talked a lot about it, are what are those triggers?
Yeah.
What are the solutions you want to have? What are the costs of each? And then what's the funding, if there's a deficiency in the funding, what are the tools to kind of get that in place? But high level, that's ultimately what we would like at the end of the process.
And it's going to take a little effort to kind of get the permitting agencies and environmental groups on board with that kind of idea, because they generally don't like the idea of an open-ended, hey, you have a permit for something that you don't need right now. They like to see a need for something and then, okay, yes, obviously there's a problem, so here's a permit, because they're issuing a permit that they know would have impacts, to the Benthic community, to the public access, and all of that. So they want to have a justification for doing that. So we have to educate them on, look, just because we're giving a permit doesn't mean that we're going to implement a project day one. We'll wait for certain triggers to be met or the conditions, warrant it. But we have to have this flexibility because we don't have 2 or 3 years of planning because of the way this inlet, works so quickly.
Well, is it safe to say that the current environment of permitting is a reactive instead of a proactive in South Carolina shoreline? I mean, pre-positioning permits, I think what you're saying is a hard sell. But if we wait until after the fact when things are devastated, that's not a good position to be filing.
I want to say, like, the agencies and OCRM specifically, I think they understand and would be open to it. It's I would say more the resource agencies like DNR and Fish and Wildlife and some of the NGO groups that, are rightfully hesitant to just recommend permits when there's not a need, but again, it's kind of an education process and understanding we're trying to avoid bad situations. And having the flexibility is critical. And we're getting to that, and we have some other projects where we've been able to successfully do that with, like at the east end of Kiowa, there was a channel that was moving into the ocean course, and we kind of went to them and said, well, we can wait till it gets to a bad situation, but we're going to have sandbags, and we're more likely to have to do a 200,000 or 300,000 yard project as opposed to if we were to do something now, we can do a 50,000 yard project, be in and out in a couple of weeks, and it's a much lower impact, but we're not waiting for that critical erosion to hit, and we were successful in that.
Stephen, we have talked a lot about triggers of when we would go to work for our purposes. Could we put those triggers in the permit request that would put them
At ease.
a little bit more at ease, that, hey,
Yeah.
we're not gonna do this until we reach this kind of critical point?
Yes,
I mean, would that,
you can certainly include triggers in the permit. I would recommend trying to minimize, the conditions in the permit to allow you as much flexibility and make that more of an internal kind of trigger where it's up to the city council to say, well, we say 1,000 feet, but if it's 800 feet, but likely to get to 1,000, okay, let's go ahead and do something. So you're really looking at the conditions at the time. Now, certain triggers and thresholds, for instance, we have a 600-foot buffer between where we would harvest sand at the avenues area. Those would be set in stone. And if there's not enough sand there, well, we don't need to do that project anyway, because then we may be jeopardizing, houses in that area. We don't want to do that. So, you pick the ones that you want to be, firm and set in stone, and then other ones would be more of an internal, hey, this is a guideline, not a steadfast rule, would be my recommendation.
And I think the argument to be made to these regulatory agencies or, the Fish and Wildlife, DNR, is when you're in a critical position, the options that we have to address that situation are much more impactful to public access and wildlife than a large-scale sort of planned process that avoids us getting to that point. And I think they recognize that.
Yes.
They'd rather do that than see the beach up and down with sandbags or trucks, scraping sand. So I think that could be we could be successful at making that argument.
Are you finding that in light of the increase in the erosion throughout the state, that the governmental agencies are being a little looser or a little more willing to do things they weren't before? For example, I understand that the large sandbags over on the north end, that they're more effective than the smaller sandbags, but nationally there are bigger sandbags that are used in Florida and North Carolina that actually are more effective, but they've never been allowed in South Carolina.
Yeah, I think speaking for OCRM on that, they're always open to better solutions, but they are bound by the regulations that they have. So if the regulations specify that, we can only use 1 cubic yard, then they have to say that. Now, they have a caveat for kind of experimental projects or research that we could go through for, things like that. And that's becoming a little bit more complicated process, it's a little bit more rigorous process because of some of the issues they've had with prior experimental devices. So there are opportunities out there, but some of that would have to come from the legislature and actually changing.
And that takes a long time.
It does,
Yeah.
but they are certainly willing to try to work with us if there's some particular opportunity where we could propose a solution. They've been pretty good about trying to work with us. To kind of get back through this.
Back to the report.
No, it's great. I love the interaction there. But when we're looking at comparative volumes, and this kind of goes to the minimum condition, here are 3 examples from 2023 of different areas of the island and what the beach profile looks like. The green line here is what Beechwood East looks like. And you see no dune at all. And this is all relative from the structure line. So 0 here would be the seaward side of a house. So starting at the seaward side of the house, there is 0 dune and immediately goes down into the wet sand beach and then slopes down. Now you have some sand offshore, and that's part of the shoal that's offshore of that area now. So when you're looking at volumes and if we're cutting this off at 1,000 feet, you're actually gaining some sand underwater. So you're showing a higher volume than the beach really looks like. And that can be tricky sometimes, especially around inlets, is the visual volume on the beach doesn't always correspond to the measured volume because of underwater sand. Around the center part of the island, it's a lot easier. Here's 9th Avenue, which right now is kind of right at that 380, 400 cubic yards per foot, which we're calling the minimum healthy volume. You have a swale or dune that's kind of up against the structure, a swale, another dune. You have a kind of a dry sand beach in this area, if you can kind of see that blue line there, and then you have your wet sand beach sloping down. The Citadel House, I think, has 600 or 700 cubic yards per foot. You have this huge accretional beach that's gained a bunch of sand in recent years, and then a little bit steeper slope up there. As you get further up to the east end of the island, you have a steeper beach slope because of some of the sheltering effects of the inlets and the coarser sand that's up there. So that can also change what your unit volume is just based off the beach slope.
So, Steve, can I ask a question? So I think this is the area where you're talking about at least having sort of a backup harvest area of a
Correct.
couple 100,000 cubic yards. On this that you show us out 1,200 feet, if that were to be pulled from that area, we would be, you're saying that plus the 600 feet or a couple of 100 yards beyond that, 1,200 out? In other words, how far out would you be harvesting?
We would only be harvesting sand from about -2, which is about the low tide line, up to about +4. So really in just this section here is the intertidal beach. All this is underwater down below about -2. And our estimate is that if we took the full 100,000 yards from that area, it would shift this back about 50 feet. So from there to about here. So it would shift that profile about to there.
Kind of smoothing out the curve. If you will.
Essentially, essentially it just shifts it back.
Yeah.
And is a lot of that sand from the renourishment up north of there?
Yes,
Okay, that's what,
Yeah.
it definitely seems that every time they put sand up north, it ends up.
Migrates.
yeah. And I've got, in the presentation we gave last week for the public meeting, I showed profiles from that area showing how much it's accreted,
Yeah.
and it's several hundred feet.
And the steepness seems to be from that also? Is that, because, I mean, it feels to me that it's like if it was left alone for a while, that slope would
It
even
would
out?
shallow out over time. It was a large kind of influx of sand from the project. The beach slope is generally controlled by two factors. The wave energy, so bigger wave energy creates a shallower slope because it kind of flattens it out more. And then the grain size. A coarser grain size creates a steeper slope. So
The coarser, the steeper.
correct. So if you have a real coarse beach, you generally have a steeper slope. So the nourishment sand was a little coarser than the native background sand, so that could be contributing to some of a steeper beach. But it's a combination of those factors. As you get, further into Wild Dunes in front of the east of the property owner's beach house, that area is pretty sheltered because of the delta and all the shoals break the waves energy. So you have a steeper beach there because you don't have as big of waves hitting the beach.
Yeah.
Same thing on the inlet shoreline on Dewey's Inlet. So we look at those profiles and the volumes and pick, we talked about the minimum healthy beach profile. We used to call that the ideal beach profile, but I think that's not the correct term. I think the minimum healthy beach profile is a better term because it's the least amount of sand that you want in an area until it starts to become less than ideal. So this is.
So we would kind of see this number as a trigger. Like
You would see that
below
number.
This number.
Yeah,
you need
and
to start-
actually, you're looking out ahead of that a little bit, because if that's your minimum, you want
Start,
to,
yeah.
be pumping sand at that point, essentially, and if it gets below that, that number should be high enough where it can accommodate some erosion below that, where you're not, having houses fall in,
Right.
but it's, you don't want it to get too far below that.
Do you try to figure out how much sand do I have to have in order to sustain if it's 8 years, to sustain 8 years to get us to the minimum level?
So there's kind of two things you look at. You look at, is there enough sand there to protect you from a decent storm event? So we had Hurricane Matthew. That's kind of a good example of a pretty significant storm. We saw dune erosion up to about 60 feet in some areas of the state. So, okay, at bare minimum, you probably need 60 feet of dune area to be able to accommodate a storm like that. So that's one. The other is you're looking at long-term erosion rates
Right.
and trying to maintain,
It'll make it 8
again,
years. at this
but
level.
that's more of the advanced fill on top of the ideal. So the ideal is really, what are you okay with, where you may have seasonal changes. In the winter, you're going to have a narrower beach because you have more wave energy. So you want some seasonal fluctuation in that, and that can accommodate that and the storm events. But the advanced fill is looking at the erosion rate over time.
Meaning, just to make sure I get it, as a non-science person, meaning that if we have an 8-year window,
Yeah.
we anticipate this will make it 8 years before it gets to the minimum, short of some extravagant
Right.
circumstance.
So your design of your beach volume, and if you're doing a project, say your minimum's 380, if you're losing 10 cubic yards per foot every year, you have to add 100 yards per foot on top of that when you design your
Yeah.
project. So you put 480, 500 out there so that 10 years later, you're still above that 380.
Can I ask a favor, as you're going through this, for us to get to finally make some decisions, I think as a committee here, we need to know, what do we need to provide for you as far as a decision? So for example, I think we're going through the 380 to 400 feet. Is a decision point we need to land on, is it 380, is it 400, et cetera? And if those are things, as you're going through here, you need from us, just maybe we can capture those so that in some of these subsequent meetings, we can start giving you some decisions
Yeah.
to help us
And
get through a
I think
plan.
we can do that here, based off of this data that I'm showing. As I kind of dug through this a little bit more, again, you have a little bit of variability along the island. If you're right at Breach Inlet, you have a lot of sand underwater that has to be included in that. So if you use 380, right at Breach Inlet, that's going to be a highly eroded condition because all the sand's underwater. So on this chart, the red line is kind of my recommendation for the beach volume, the minimum healthy volume, and it peaks up here at Breach Inlet because it accounts for that sand that's offshore. As you get towards the center part of the island, it trends down, and from the center part of the island, looking, again, back up here at 9th Avenue, to me, that's a very good example visually. It's a good example kind of from the data. We have 2 healthy dunes in that system. Nobody's really complained about the beach. We haven't had to do any work in that area. We have had some erosion occurring, and then it builds back. So even during those erosive events, we've been pretty healthy up there. And that's right at that 380 cubic yards per foot value there.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Just to get some clarity, as to the north and the southern areas where the problems are, if you put this amount of sand there today, if we did the project and we put it in there to that safeguard, is that going to be more or less or the same as was there at the end of the last renourishment?
I can show you that here. So you're referring to the north end now because that's not
Because the south end didn't have a problem,
Yeah.
correct?
So right now, this chart shows the maximum volume we've measured in the green. That's the most sand that we've ever measured on the beach. The orange is the least amount of sand we've ever measured. The blue is the average, and the black is where we're at today, or where we're at in 2023. So right now, this area is the Beechwood East Dunecrest area, and we're below that 380 number. But on average, we've been much healthier. We have, as you get towards the Grand Pavilion in 2018, this area is the Grand Pavilion. It was being impacted at that point, pretty significantly so. We were close to 100 yards per foot low. So that kind of gives you the range of where we've been in the recent past, where we're at today compared to that ideal. And it makes sense, just kind of, again, visually. Here at Ocean Club is this point right here. Ocean Club sticks way out, so it's got a lower volume because it's, again, if you have a straight line on the beach and one building sticks out, its relative volume is going to be lower. And it's kind of right there at that, okay, we're not really happy with that volume. It's not awful, but it's right at that minimum healthy beach condition. So the center part of the island is huge and wide, and the houses are set way back, so I don't want to ignore it, but it's been gaining sand. We're right now close to or above the maximum volume we've ever measured there between 21st and 53rd Avenue.
But it also gains sand from the renourishment.
Correct.
So, but for the renourishment, they want to be as healthy as they are because it's added on all this new sand.
Right. Since 2009, Reach 4, which is kind of this area here, has gained about 1 million cubic yards of sand, and most of that is from the nourishment project. Did that answer your question?
I think so.
Okay.
And so, Stephen, and I want to take this opportunity to maybe speak to that point. I know we've had some concerns from folks around the avenues about this proposed shoal management project, and one of the 2 harvest areas that we're proposing to have the ability to, in the event that we need to, harvest sand. Harvesting sand from that area, could be seen as returning some of the sand from the beach nourishment project to this area?
I think honestly, recycling is a better word for it, because that sand along those avenues is coming from the north. It's coming from the Wild Dunes area, 53rd North. So by placing all that material there with our projects, it overwhelmed the system. That sand is moving south, and it's moving, so much of it moves south that it's more than you need. It's like getting a big Christmas bonus, but you got to spend it all right then. If you could take that and spread it out over the year, you're moving some of that sand back to the north where it will return through there. So they have more than they need now, but if there's no sand coming down now because we're in this erosional period, it kind of cuts off the funding for the next 2 or 3 years. The sand, it's still leaving that area, moving further south, but you're going to have less sand coming into it. So by shifting some of that back up, and again, it's a very small percentage of what's been gained. We're being very, very conservative with the quantity there.
Can you speak to that?
Right, so the maximum quantity we're proposing is 100,000 yards from that area.
Is it 2 events though, Steve? The way that reads, it's sort of, is it 100,000 or is it 200,000 over 5?
It's 100,000, and yeah, I don't know that it's limited to 100,000 total or 100,000 per event. It is limited it is 2 events,
I think
limited.
it's 2 events, 100,000
Yeah.
max per event. So it could be it almost, and maybe it's just a clarification on how it's worded, but I think the interpretation is that it's potentially up to 200,000.
Yeah, when I read through it, I'm not sure that it was clear on whether it was per event or total from that area. I think it just kind of mentioned 100,000 yards would be the maximum from that area.
That's how it read to me. I know that the 2 event was specific for the shoal, up to 250,000 cubic
That's the
yards.
other area.
Well, I think there's 2 events under that permit, regardless of where the sand comes from. And there's a limit of 250,000 yards per event that could be moved. And then it also had a limit that 100,000 yards from that harvest area. And I think it's probably ambiguous, and that's something we probably need to clean
Clarify,
up.
yeah.
On
If that's
whether
the
it's
intention,
per
is the
event.
intention 100,000 total? Or-
From the engineering standpoint, I'd like to see the flexibility to have that there. Again, if you're 5 years into this permit, we want to look at the beach condition at that time and say, does it make sense to take it from there? One, if the shoal is accessible, that's our priority area, period. We'd much rather take the sand from there. But like we were this past fall, the shoal wasn't accessible, so it's kind of up to the council to decide, is it the better option to, with the beach condition there at the avenues, I would recommend, yes, there's a surplus of sand there, let's take it from that area and try to buy time. But again, with having that trigger there, if the beach condition is eroded to a point where you wouldn't want to take the 100,000 yards anyway, we're going to be landward of that 600-foot buffer, and it wouldn't be an option.
What I'm hearing you say, though, which I think is very important for people to understand, is that if you take sand from, let's say, 45th right now and move it up north, it's going to come right back down within a couple of years to right back to where it is today. If you don't, it's going to keep moving its way down to
Good point.
30, 40, 20. So people are like, oh, I'm going to lose property. I mean,
The sand is going to be eroding from that area regardless.
Right.
The sand, there's nothing we can do to stop sand from leaving that area. And whether it's the sand so if we didn't do a project, the beach is, say, 700 feet wide now, in a year, it might be 650 feet wide. if we
Yeah,
move
it's not
that
like it's
sand,
gonna
it's
be- it's not a-
650 and
it's
then it's
not-
600.
I mean, this is a
Those numbers
good-
are, yeah.
solid area, so
Yeah.
it's not like they're gonna, if we
Yeah.
don't do anything, they're gonna go down to
Right,
below the red line.
correct.
Right, but this is more, like you said, recycling. We're turning, this sand is gonna stay in a cycle where it moves up and then it moves back down. I mean, to me,
Correct.
that makes sense.
Yeah, and we also, I mean, we don't want to take so much sand that it does start to starve sand moving to the south, because that sand is moving, to the rest of the front beach and eventually does get down to Breach Inlet. It's hard to see that trend in the data, because over time and distance, it starts to peter out, but to kind of move through and get to some of the big numbers here. Along the current erosional area at the north end, we have about 50,000 yards that we would need to just get everybody back to the minimum, which is a fairly low number, but we do anticipate some additional erosion over the next 12 months as the shoal is attaching. Once the shoal is attached, it's going to add several 100,000 yards and, could restore that area on its own without any supplement. But I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen in the next 12 months. It may, take 24 months for that sand to actually start restoring that area. The big picture numbers, I don't want to beat this horse, but we can. This is, again, the same kind of minimum healthy beach volume, just focusing on the south end right now. And these are stations, so not reaches. So again, Station 50 here is around 6th Avenue. And going back to 2015 to now, so each set of bars is a different survey date. So at Station 50, we've been above the volume until the past 2 years, in 23 and then 24. We dropped below the minimum healthy volume there. As you go further to the north, Station 80 is up by the pier. It's significantly more healthy. Again, that big jump is because the buildings start to jump back there. So, but down at the south end, right around the inlet, the volumes have been very stable. They kind of go up and down a little bit, but then they just fall off a cliff the past 2 years. And I kind of set this line based off of that fact that, in 2021, we were pretty healthy and everybody was in good shape, and then when it's not. So just a little bit more details on the minimum volume and what we would need to get to that point, or to restore that.
I guess that what's interesting about that is just how consistent it has been year over year. I mean, you lose a little, you gain it the next day, and then 2 years ago, you see that decline. And I guess that, in our conversations, almost daily now, about what is that trigger? And could we have seen a trigger 4 years ago? We were looking at the same data, there's nothing. I mean, now we know, we've kind of lived through it, but on the south end, there's nothing that would have indicated in terms of volumes that there is a problem.
Yeah.
And that you just see that very quick change that we all saw, in real life. So I think it's just helpful in trying to understand that and know that it's so dynamic that we have to get creative too in identifying what those triggers are. And I think that having a permit in place, knowing that it could have happened because we saw it happen, last year, have something in place that would allow us to, as quickly as conditions are changing, which we saw they were, as quickly we can maybe execute a project, depending on the condition of the time.
Yeah, because if you look at the first, the peak there, the top, right where your cursor is, yeah. So from 2015 to, what's the next one after, is that 16?
Yep.
You had almost the exact same drop as you did from 21 to 22. Mm-hmm. But
look at what happened after.
But it went right, but that
Yeah.
time it went up and this time it went down.
But would that not necessarily be visible to the eye? And you do have almost a little forward indicator right there with that year before, but we just maybe didn't see it.
Yeah, and
Is that segue into a trigger potentially?
and again, when you're at an inlet, it's difficult because you may see volume loss, but the beach may gain width. You may see growth of the dry sand beach and the channel moves closer to it. And you can't always predict that channel is going to, the next year, take the dry sand away.
Is the inconsistent patterns that we're seeing here consistent with other communities around the East Coast?
Around an inlet, it's just a dynamic area, and each one's unique. As you get further to the north, away from that inlet effect, that's more consistent with what we've seen, in other areas. And when you're looking at kind of triggers, this is an example from Edisto Beach where you're away from the inlets and it's a little more consistent. So you see there was a nourishment project done between the bright blue and the light blue line that jumped the volumes up. And then every year they lose a little bit of sand. And when you have a situation like that, it's a lot more easy to predict because okay, we're losing 4 cubic yards per foot every year. And we're right here now, so we know in 4 years we're probably going to hit our trigger. That's the ideal scenario where you can kind of plan well out ahead of time.
That'd be nice.
Yeah, and you can see that a little bit, as you get into the Front Beach area here at Station 50, 60, 70. But again, with the inlet, it's hard to do that. Now,
Stephen, you go back to that beach. And Scott, on a point that you made earlier, kind of identifying bright line, agreeable figures to plan around. One of them is obviously that minimum healthy beach profile that we've kind of talked about, figuring a number. I think another critical one for us that builds the long-range plan is the erosion rate at each end.
It's like a delta from year to, instead of just the raw number where it is, it's the change,
change.
the delta that's going to trigger something.
And Stephen's kind of, we've talked about, and he's kind of explained the challenge of, and this graph shows
that,
it
yeah.
well, that if you were to plan on the erosion rate being the last 2 years, it would be kind of, a drastic number and a massive number. If you plan for it over a 10-year period, it probably is almost negligible. So how do you choose kind of a realistic erosion rate? And that erosion rate obviously builds once you've chosen the cadence of the projects, which is going to be another kind of
Hitting the paper,
bright
I
line
think it's
number.
like-
It obviously builds off of that, but
Kind of an annual or.
I want to jump on that point because I think it's a great one you brought in. I wanted to ask you is, money aside, let's just pretend money's irrelevant. I know that Outer Banks, just for right now, but Outer Banks
we're going to get there.
does it every 5 years. And I think Wrightsville, I heard, does it every 4 years. Is the way that, and I know by extending it to the 8 to 10 years that it's in here, that part of the theory is to plan ahead with having more beach built onto it in order to make it the 10 years. Would it be better for us to consider a shorter window and less beach? Is it safer or a longer window? How do you come up with that
It's a good
evaluation of
question.
8 to 10 years?
Yeah.
Because I know that's what we've historically done, but I also know that because things can change so quickly, if we don't
Yeah.
plan ahead, it may be a failure without real true protections.
Yeah, so-
And then I know that getting the permits to do the things that we need to do takes time, so then we're stuck in this void where we can't do anything.
Yeah, the beaches up there tend to have a higher erosion rate, so they require just more frequent erosion. Now, I think the Wrightsville project largely is based off of the navigation dredging. So they're trying to dredge the inlets, which do fill in a lot quicker. So some of those projects are related to that. So the timeline is more driven by navigation projects as opposed to beach nourishment.
They need a place to put the sand. What you're saying is that when they do the dredge, they need a place to put the sand,
Yeah.
so it's convenient to put it on the beach,
Right.
right? So it's mutually beneficial.
Correct.
All right.
Correct. And that's what they're, hoping to get a long-term plan for at the south end is rather than doing these projects to dredge it out of the spoil islands, which is, again, not disposal islands,
Sediment area.
sediment containment area, they will directly place it on the beach if it's beach compatible. And that, if the erosion rates at the south end return to where they have been historically, those projects should be sufficient to sustain that end for a long time without the city having to do anything. Right now, there's about a 250,000 yard deficit at the south end. They're planning to place 500,000 yards of sand at minimum there. So that will completely restore the deficit. Recently, if we take the last 5 years' worth of erosion at the south end, it's about 65,000 yards per year that it's losing, which again, I think in historical sense is still a high number, but it's 5 years. So it's not just the last two, which have been really high. It does average it out a little bit. But I think that's an appropriate planning event, planning level there, and I think that's kind of what I mentioned.
So one of the other decision points you need from us is going to be intervals. What interval, and is it going to be a different interval for the middle of the island than it is for the two inlet areas?
Well,
Are those decision
Project
points?
intervals,
Yeah.
Scott?
And based on a trigger event.
Right.
You know, What are our target intervals to get the renourishment
I mean,
project to where we
I
want it
really
to be a
think
healthy
it would be in
healthy
y'all's
beach?
best interest to try to align the two ends of the island if it's needed, where you're doing them at the same time, because mobilization, you're gonna have to pay, a $4 to $5 million mobilization to get a dredge on site. And it would be one mobilization to do both projects. It may be a little higher if you're combining, because they'd have to bring in some additional pipe, but you're not looking at, $2 or $3 million more dollars. You're looking at, a couple $100,000 maybe to mobilize for both ends, as opposed to two separate mobilizations to do that. So over, the course of, and this kind of relates back to your question on the timing, we ran the math. If you do a project every 6 years compared to every 10 years, adjusting for the erosion rate, you have to do bigger projects every 10 years. But over a 30-year period, you're doing 4 projects every 10 years, or you're doing 6 projects at every 6 years, because you have the one at year 0. So that saves you about $10 million in mobilization over that 30-year period. Plus you're getting some additional sand on the beach. So, that's not an insurmountable number where you solely base your decision off of that, but it's certainly a substantial number.
So in a 30-year period, if you do a project every 10 years versus every 6 years, the difference is you end up with a larger volume on the beach because you're doing bigger projects every 10 years, and you save $10 million, roughly.
Yeah, the math gets a little tricky when we ran it, but essentially it's about a $10 million savings, because it's 2 less mobilizations. The volume that you're putting at the end of that time, you end up with more volume with the 10-year projects. So the total price you're paying isn't as significant, but you've basically got an extra project in place like that, and we can work through that math one
And
day.
and the low point of the beach is the same in both scenarios, because you're going to replenish when it gets back to that unhealthy.
Yeah, and essentially the difference is you're adding more sand to account for the extra 4 years, which at the south end I feel a lot more comfortable with, because it's a more consistent erosion historically, because it's not as affected by the inlet. At the east end, or the north end, you're going, with these shoals, it's, we've shown that the projects can last, 5 years really without any kind of effort, and then after that, you may have a shoal that's causing a problem. Again, would you want to do a large-scale project right now with the condition when most of that area is healthy, or have that interim project? So having a 10-year time frame with the option for an interim project is, I think, a good planning goal, but then having the permit in place should year 7, 8, or 9 warrant it, because we've just lost a ton of sand, had big storms, whatever it may be, it certainly doesn't hurt. So I think my recommendation would be 3 years or so after the last big nourishment project, start the permitting for the next one, so that in year 5, you would have a permit in hand for a large-scale project. At the same time, you'd have a permit in hand for the shoal management projects. But then from year 5 to 10, you would have that permission, ready to go at any moment for either of those 2 projects.
Okay, so we need to decide, I don't know if I heard this right. So on the intervals, you're saying go to where base your intervals on your inlets, because those are going to be the trigger, the most demand. So we need to give you kind of that interval. And then also, from a permitting standpoint, you'd like to know what our trigger points on that are as part of the policy.
Yeah, I think having kind of a timeline again. After the last project, by year 3 or 4, you want to be working towards that permit, so that 5 years after the last large-scale project, at the latest, you would want to have your permit in hand. because that covers you for the next 5 years.
Yeah, because each
and-
permit you said was good for 5 years.
It's good for 5 years without having to do
Do
anything. And
environmental.
it's very likely you could get it extended as long as you're monitoring the beach and kind of showing that you're working on it. You may have to make some supplemental environmental reviews to kind of keep it up to date. But, if we're fortunate and we can get more than 10 years out of a project,
So we're just playing within the windows. We've created one target window, then we have another flexible window, basically, with each cycle as we go through the monitoring process, to then pull the trigger, like you're saying, have a menu of options, A, B, C, D, E, whatever.
yeah.
Go as long as-
And for funding may not have to align perfectly with that. You could have a funding plan where, maybe every 8 years you knew you were funded for the project. And if you could get the 10 years, great, and you're building that piggy bank. So that if you have to do a project in year 7, you're not, way short on the funds on it.
So maybe it's out of your, partly in your territory, but maybe it makes sense to figure out what the funding would be for example, 5 years, 7.5 years, 10 years, and then separately the city can figure out what they anticipate having in funding from the taxes and from the Wildlands contribution, and see, can we actually afford to do it in 5 years, or is it 7.5 years, or 10 years? Because I think maybe the funding is pretty significant right now.
Yeah.
Because
Now
they-
the funding is relevant.
I'm sorry?
Now the funding is
It's not
relevant.
relevant for him. But he can put together the numbers for the
Yeah.
5, 7.5, and 10 years. I think that might be helpful for us
Yeah.
to see.
Yeah, I do too.
And I think-
What we're doing is we're trying to trade off what makes sense. But if you're telling me 5 years seems to be very safe for the northern side, and 10 years is generally safe for the middle of the island and more the south, depending on what the south does, then maybe we can look at different intervals and try to figure out what makes sense.
To that end, we have been kind of in the budgeting process for the entire city, looking at kind of these different scenarios and just trying to kind of forecast. Aligning the projects seemed to make the biggest difference. And there still is a significant increase in cost between, a 5 or 6 year interval and a 8 to 10 year interval. But aligning the projects and deleting one of the mobilizations for 2 ends
It's
seemed to
substantial,
have
Makes a
the
difference,
biggest
yeah.
impact on the forecast on the funding.
And it could be that it changes. For example, 1 year you do it every 5 years, and then you say, 5 years later, we're doing great, why don't we do it,
Right.
make it 10 years?
Yeah.
Yeah, especially at the south end, if the Corps continues to place sand there, it might eliminate the need for that, and that's easy to adjust in your, the permit would be the same, the permit would allow it, but you just don't nurse that in.
Well, I think your page 14 is going to illustrate that when we.
Is the beneficial use by the Corps, is that in the foreseeable future only going to be in the south end? Like, would they ever, I know never say never, but,
It's likely to be only at the south end. Now, they do have dredging that occurs closer to the north end of the island. It's just a lot further distance to get it out to the beach. There could be an option where the city could supplement the funding for their project and basically pay the difference in cost to get it to the beach, if it's enough beach-compatible material to make it make sense. So that it is an option, and they included the entire island as a potential placement area in their environmental review.
So they've already accounted for it to a certain extent.
yeah.
Yeah,
The
they
whole
wanted
beach.
to,
Yeah.
they wanted to, again, having flexibility and as many tools as you can is huge. So to kind of get into some of the cost scenario here,
Dun, dun, dun.
yeah, the 3% inflation factor is what really kills us here, but
None of us
it's real.
Yeah.
I didn't even want to look.
I'll probably still be.
You might still be here.
I hope so. But I looked at some comparable projects, and we have been pretty favorable in our bid prices that we've got here. The logistics are pretty favorable for dredgers. They're easy access to marina and our safe harbor, so it allows them a little more confidence in their bids. So our bids have been $6 to $8 a yard compared to $12, $13, $14 a yard for some of our other projects. If you go to a core project, they're looking at $19, $20 a yard or more for core projects. But the mobilization is $4 to $5 million to get a big dredge out here. Now, another thing with having a flexible permit or having a permit in hand is the ability to take advantage of the dredging industry when they have availability. That it can be a huge cost savings for mobilization and pumping cost. If they're begging for work, then you get a much more favorable cost. And sometimes we bid projects out where they have options of building in year A or year B, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. One will be higher than the other, but sometimes there's a significant savings from one year to the next. So that would allow more flexibility. But just jumping down to this table, this, again, is focusing on one project that includes both ends of the island. So it's kind of a worst-case scenario, but a 10-year interval, looking at how much volume do we need every 10 years to account for just the erosion rate. The erosion rate at the north end, we're losing about 100,000 yards of sand per year, based off the 2008 to 2018 period, which we use that period because it includes one of the shoal attachments. If we ignore the shoal attachments, you're going to have a much higher need for volume, and that's kind of where we're at right now. Is we're not including this shoal that's attaching right now, but if we waited 2 or 3 years for the recent erosion rates, we'd capture all that sand. But that's a pretty good estimate of what we're losing each year. So we have a $5 million mobilization cost. I'm assuming a $10 per yard pumping cost, and add those numbers up, and we're at about a $22 million project for, that's about as much sand as we placed on the east end in 2018, the 1.68 million. I think that project was 13.5 million construction cost. So that's maybe a little high of an estimate, but I think,
Ballpark.
yeah, it's a ballpark.
Yeah. Is this, now in these scenarios, when we're doing the pumping costs, would that be considered a combination of new sand, recycled sand?
This is all new sand from offshore bar areas.
Okay.
This does not include an interim shoal management project, which probably should be included in a,
For
planning.
budgeting purposes and planning
Yeah.
purposes?
And if I had to ballpark that, I would say $1 million every 10 years to account for, one significant project during the middle.
And so I think there's a lot of conversation about trucking versus that too. Now, I guess this is all new sand, so it may not apply, but to truck sand in is about, I think we last was $42 per cubic yard for comparison, and this is 10, just for a comparison. Okay.
Yeah, so as soon as you get over volumes of about 150 to 200,000, the economics make a lot more sense for offshore projects, plus just the impact to having tens of thousands of trucks coming onto the beach.
Okay.
And just for, I guess for anybody watching that, my understanding is that this is based on an inflation rate that goes on. So right now, the city has a tax that they generate revenue on. Wild Dunes contributes a significant amount of money from their revenue they generate, which I think maybe together is like $16, $17 million sitting there right now. Not all abused at once, but it's there. So in the same way that the inflation rate will apply to the renourishment project, it'll also apply to all the taxes that are out there generating money. So it should equal out, I guess, over time, theoretically. Yes. And it's because it's such a staggering number. People are watching this thing. If they're not aware of that,
Yeah.
they don't understand that how do we get, $29 million or $30 million, but there are things set into place now that generate the money that it's accumulating from.
Correct. And this
That,
is,
I guess that's assuming that the revenues will grow in part as the increase in cost, which I don't
Might be
know if we
more.
can.
Well, and I
Maybe.
think it's a good source of revenue, there's no question, but it's also a variable. It's a variable revenue
Correct.
stream that if we had an event or something, that might impact our ability to fund for a
Well,
short
and we're
period of time.
maximized.
Right.
I agree, and I'm always concerned walking the beaches now that, and this is something Outer Banks said, that they want to be able to promote the fact they have healthy beaches. And that if you want a vacation here, it's healthy, and if you walk towards Breach Inlet or you walk towards part of Wild Dunes, it's not looking very pretty, it's not very healthy. At high tide, you can't walk past some of the homes, and so that works as a detriment. I think if we fix it, we'll generate more revenue, is my thought.
And when we do get to the funding conversation, I think like Dare County, they had a bit more fixed revenue streams that were funding their beach renourishment as opposed to variable revenue streams.
No, well, their revenue stream, or their, what they call their, it's the equivalent of our accommodations tax. So it is still based on heads on beds.
Okay, they had it for the full county though.
For the
Was-
full
wasn't-
county.
Yeah, yeah.
That
They
is
weren't- They
true.
weren't necessarily exposed to a single event that could wipe.
Well,
They could, they are.
Because if they had a hurricane or something that took out their tourism for
The whole
a
county.
year, it took all the homes. So a Hurricane Hugo event
That could do it, sure.
would do them in.
Yeah,
And
their revenue,
Also, their entire county
It's
is,
based off tourism.
is,
I thought they
is
did
on the
property
coast.
tax, too.
so it's a
They-
combination. The county pays a portion of the cost of the project, and that revenue is generated through an accommodations tax that is implemented countywide.
Countywide.
So it includes about 6 or 7 municipalities. But the other portion, that's only maybe between 20 and 40%. The other portion is paid for by each municipality, and each municipality has a different tax mechanism where the property owners make up that difference.
They had a two-tier, like.
That's the
some
special
paid more, and then,
tax.
Yeah, they had a special tax zones. that-
Correct. There's some municipalities that charge the same tax to anybody on the island. There are others that have a system where those up Front Beach pay a higher percentage, and everybody pays something, but it's depending on your proximity to the beach.
Right, it's
But
more-
it's a combination of tourism
Homeowner-based.
and
Ours, I
homeowners.
think, is mostly tourism-based.
Right now, the only revenue the city gets for beach preservation is based on accommodations, which is a 1% on all rooms that are rented on the island.
And just kind of as a reminder, if there is some significant storm event, that would open up FEMA up at the East End funds, because it is a qualified beach project. If we were to do a project at the south end, before a storm, it would also qualify for FEMA fundings, which is 75%. And historically, or recently, the state's been pretty good about pitching in the other 25%. So you could, feasibly get a supplemental project, a restoration project from that storm at, little to no cost to the city.
I guess the question is, while we get that money, how long would it put out our income source, I mean, still, you have to
Correct.
build everything back.
Yeah.
And when we all have demand to try and build our homes back, or whatever may occur. 'Cause if you remember the pictures from Hugo, it looked like a lawnmower came through, right?
Well,
Through
that-
a big portion of the state.
it-
I know you
And that's an
remember.
interesting point, because what North Carolina said they did, and I'm not suggesting we do it, but they said they actually borrowed the money. And they kept enough money left over, so if they had to go for a year without any tourism, they would survive. We've been able to self-fund it historically without having to borrow any money. So I guess maybe that would be an answer
Yeah.
if that occurred.
And I think that that's a valid question. It hasn't, borrowing money for these projects has not been done before by the city, but not to say that it's worthy of a conversation. Can we build a model with our revenues that makes that make sense?
And go ahead.
And that's going back to your earlier point about the more that you do, at a time, the more in the 30 years out, you save. If you borrow money, you end up paying more over 30 years, but maybe it is worth looking at that and seeing, is the interest rates that we're going to be pay, the money that we're going to pay extra in borrowing, is that canceled out by doing a larger project that is going to
Last us
last,
longer.
and we have less mobilization costs, and so we actually end up saving money by borrowing, which sounds kind of crazy, but it seems like that is a possibility. And I feel like that's something that we would need somebody that knows more about banking than me. But
Well, and we have a financial advisor that we've worked with in
Yeah.
the past, and that's a model that we can, we've had conversations about getting a model played out, considering that option.
yeah,
I think the Talent Polys borrowed a significant amount for their last project in 2020.
with the intent that it's a big enough project that it's
Well,
probably going to save
I mean, I
them more
think
in the long run, or just because they
I
had to.
think really it was the only way
Right,
that they
just
could
the
actually
only
get a
way to do it.
project put
Yeah.
in, and they were in dire need of it.
Yeah,
And frankly, I think the city back in before the 2018 project, at what point considered it? Not there was no action to do it, but it was one of the options that the city looked at, I think, because we had the ability to get money from FEMA from those two events that generated a lot of, it made a lot of the
And
difference.
the state had a lot of money.
And the state had
The
money.
funding kind of fell into our lap in 2018.
Was perfect. It was just, the perfect storm from a financial perspective.
With
But
these plans and these kind of numbers too, I mean, we haven't considered that maybe dual path of the Army Corps. You know, is that also another, maybe, do you need a decision from us on, hey, if we pursue the Army Corps, which might be 5 years down the road if we start now to get sand on our beach, does that impact anything we're planning here? Or can these two be kind of mutually exclusive plans?
I think initially they could be mutually exclusive. I mean, permitting, you could have a permit for both sides, even if the Corps is planning on doing something too, because until the Corps actually has funds appropriated, there's no guarantee that anything's going to happen. So I think you want to apply, or you want to be prepared to act independently until, you know, you're sure something's going to happen.
I'm just asking, I mean, in our financial plan if we're doing this, this is great, but should we also consider, do you need a decision from us? Hey, do we want to, as a community, spend $1.5 million to get our application process going to get into that Army Corps chute, so to speak?
Yeah, I think that decision would have to kind of be based off of what the Corps felt like was a realistic project, you know, where they felt like the cost benefit scenario would apply. So you would identify what areas would be covered, because, you know, right now, not that the center part of the island needs sand, but it probably wouldn't qualify because it's got so much sand, there wouldn't be a net benefit to it.
And then Wild Dunes
The Wild
doesn't
Dunes isn't going to
qualify.
qualify because it's behind a gate. So that part would have to be separate anyway. So if you could identify what portions of the island may qualify, which they won't be able to tell you until they do the study, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But you can kind of make some assumptions, then
$3 million study.
you can try to incorporate that. I mean, we can make an assumption that the south end would qualify. It probably would, but I can't tell you how much sand it would qualify for, because the way they build it's a little different. They kind of design a profile that withstands a certain storm that's based off of a probability derived from a million different model scenarios. And so if you're 80% there, then you'll qualify for the 20% to meet that condition. That may be a different calculation than what we feel like, you know, is a 10-year erosion rate plus the way we kind of do it.
And if half of those costs out in year 20 and 30 or to the south end of the island, is it worth investing that to just have them on the stand? I don't know the answer to that question, but is that something we need to provide a decision to?
I was thinking that the kind of looking at the soonest they could have, if we were to start the process, the soonest that they could have sand showing up was so far out.
It was 5 years, yeah.
At least.
And I think it was even,
I think
felt like it was
I
even
think
more
5
than
years
that.
was the
I asked the
study.
question. I asked the question, if we started now in the process, when would we have our first sand on the beach? And I think she ended up saying 5 years. Yeah.
It was 3 years for the study, 5 years approximately, 5 to 6 years
With
for
the
the
permitting
sand.
and all, yeah.
Yeah.
well, maybe it included the notion that we would have had to have done something by the time they got, so maybe, I guess in my mind, I was thinking realistically it was
Yeah. It's
farther
like-
out than that, I
The way I
guess.
kind of understood it is like, let's run, like you're saying, independently, have our plan and have our 10-year plan. But we could run concurrently
Yeah.
with the Army Corps, because then at year 10, there may be savings acquired from that by hopefully there's funding. 10 years from now, there's funding for maybe the south end, and we work it in conjunction and have more money to adjust for the north end.
Yeah.
Or account for increase in cost.
Yeah.
But
That's kinda-
we work that cost share, but it could stretch our dollar a little further, looking 10, 15, 20 years down the road. But for immediate needs, like what we're kind of trying to look at too, that we'd be on our own for that.
Yeah, I mean,
If I understood it correctly.
Yeah, my optimistic view is, let's see how this project performs. You know, when they're adding 500,000 yards of sand, again, that restores everything that's been lost plus more in that area since 2009. And if they do that, and then if the civil works side comes back in 3 or 4 years and dredges another, 50 to 100,000 yards, I have no idea how much sand they may actually would place, but if they do that, I don't know how that would play into the federal storm damage reduction project, how those two different federal they're all part of civil works, but they're kind of two different people. How that plays in, and it may complicate things even further down there. But I'm pretty optimistic with what they're going to do, that it may kind of change the calculus down there. And if it does work well, it may end up making that south end not eligible for the federal storm damage reduction project, which on one hand is great because your beach is healthy, but you kind of might lose out on some of the benefits of the federal 50-year project. It's just, I hate to be vague with that, but there's a lot that could happen between now and then.
I guess,
We've learned with this project that we're waiting on that.
Yeah.
There's a need to be vague.
can I ask a quick question? Because you talked about Folly investing in their beach and taking the loan for it in 2020.
That was Polly's.
Polly, sorry, I misheard you then.
Okay.
And then the question's relevant.
Okay.
Because
Sorry.
Follies is getting federal, they have a
They're
federal
on
beach
right.
project going on right now.
Yeah, and
Okay.
Polly's actually had an approved project since 2004. They had a federally approved project. Funds were never appropriated for it. So they went out on their own and did a project.
Okay.
And then, as they were doing it, funds became appropriated. And so the Corps is still trying to get easements to do that now. We're 4 years later.
Off topic, if I have to step out, is that gonna mess up the city with proceeding with a quorum? Does that not make a difference?
Yes.
It will mess it up.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can.
Well, I
we
think,
can
I
wrap
think
up
we
here.
can,
Rebalance.
yeah, you
For an
know,
hour and a half in.
oh, that's right.
Sorry.
Well, I think this is very helpful. Hopefully, we can come up with a date for our next meeting if we want to meet next Friday and continue the recurring meeting on Friday mornings, to have the entire group digest the report and maybe get some consensus on some of the decision points that the committee wants to recommend so that we can finalize at least a draft of the report that would be included as part of the recommendations that this committee will be making to council.
Well, do we want to, yeah, I mean, do we want to provide a list of the decision points that the committee kind of needs to have to provide to you? I mean, I've got a few,
Yeah.
I drafted down like 3 or 4 with the,
So I would just, from my standpoint,
Yep.
kind of things that we have felt like we want the group's blessing on, the minimum healthy beach profile.
Yep.
The erosion rates
Yep.
for each end, the cadence of projects and permits. So
intervals. Yeah.
That's that kind of, different window. Triggers, small scale project, mid-scale kind of shoal management project, large scale projects. And then I think from my standpoint, we then kind of get to the, whatever that results in a funding program and source. So that's kind of what I had in my notes as points that we want just to get, Stevens, I think given a good basis for each of those except for funding, how we're going to get the money, but to just kind of drill down maybe specifically on those points and any more on your list, Scott, that.
No, I think we do have to at some point discuss whether or not we want, and it may be separate from this, do we want to recommend pursuit of the Army Corps?
Army Corps
for the
project,
For the
yes.
long term and I think, Katie, you brought this up several times on kind of a belt and suspenders insurance policy that might save us a lot of money down the road. I think that's a decision that we've got to decide if we want to recommend. Is that what?
And we do have, y'all recall, after the meeting with Nancy Parrish from the Army Corps of Engineers, we asked for what information we needed to provide and what time frame she's gotten back to us and gave us a draft of a letter of intent and timing. We would need to submit a letter of intent, which is not a contractual obligation, by the end of June.
I thought we kind of decided just to go ahead and send that. I mean, right, because there's no downside to sending that letter.
If awarded, the city would be committing to paying 50% of the cost of that feasibility study, which could be about $1.5 million.
So once you send the letter, it is basically a contract. I mean,
It's not a contract, but I would be making.
you're stuck if they give it to you.
I would be making interpretations of and commitments, funding commitments, without the city being behind that.
Okay. I thought there was still, after the letter, I thought you could still get out of it if you wanted to.
You could, but
Oh,
I think it would be beneficial to wrap it up as part of a recommendation.
There was one other thing, and I think we talked about a few meetings ago, and I don't know where we are with it. Dan, you may have some insight on the appetite, but I would like to know, what would it take to qualify Wild Dunes for federal funding? Is it 200 spots, 150 spots? Is it, from a quote, public access there'd be talk about, reserving or, paid parking. There might be some ways, I mean, what would the minimum requirement be to open up Wild Dunes for public funding? I don't know the answer to that.
From my understanding, I think the federal government defers to the state rules in South Carolina, so the state criteria is based off of certain number of parking spots from a beach access.
Per access, yeah, and it's a
Right.
pretty low number, I know.
Yeah, 6 is the minimum. That gets you an eighth of a mile either direction from the access. And then 10 gets you a quarter mile, 25 gets you a half mile, plus there may be a need for a shower or something like that. As you go
Garbage.
further than that, you need lifeguards and.
So it'd be
and more.
six per access point, and how many access points are there?
We can come,
Yeah.
at the
It would
next
just be nice
meeting,
to
we
know.
can
It may
give
not
a.
go- It may go nowhere, but,
Knowledge is good.
yeah,
Right, you know.
it couldn't hurt, yeah.
And we can ask, the Walden's Community Association, whether that's something that they would consider, would be willing to have a conversation on, but in terms of the numbers, we can come up with that based on the state regulations and present that to you all at the next meeting.
Okay.
I really don't have beach access points.
That's the
I mean,
challenge, too.
Other than the property owner's beach house, and we have talked about even residents, that part of the challenge is they just don't have the layout to accommodate
Access,
access.
yeah. And that may
Laid
be,
out
that
that
may be
way.
that may be the answer, but that's just, it'd be good to know.
Are we all good?
Okay, yeah, motion to adjourn?
So,
sorry.
next Friday? Did we say Friday at 9?
Friday, the 7th.